No mai, haere mai. Ki tēnei hui. This is public and live streamed. Beautiful. And we all go over to you, Sarah, to introduce our guests. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. So I have with me the team that are, well, 2/3 of the team who are going around the country at the moment, sort of informing councils and trying to get buy-in for what we call now the Ratepayer Assistance Scheme, formerly the Ratepayer Financing Scheme.
The RAS.
Don't quite know why we're moving like RAS rolls off the tongue a lot better than REFS, I think. So I have Hugo Ellis of Cameron Partners on that side, and then Scott Necklin from LGNZ. We were hoping to have Mark Butcher of LGFA. Too many of those here with us today, or at least virtually with us today, but he is stuck on a plane somewhere over Toronto, so unfortunately cannot dial in. If we have any tricky funding questions of that nature, I'm more than happy to take them away and ask him offline and bring them back to you.
Or answer them yourself, because you probably can.
I'm not sure that they'd like me speaking for them. I will give it a crack as usual, but so I will hand over. So just a bit of process and formality before I do hand over. Obviously, we're talking about the RAS today, and a number of councils have already committed to joining with a financial contribution, and they're kind of back in the scheme. This is being driven somewhat by the fact that the Minister for Local Government has asked for a report back on the scheme by August, yes, and so we are looking to expedite this decision here at Council, noting you have a lot of other decisions to make at the moment ahead of the end of June, to make sure that we can be in and help meet those timelines. To that end, once we've given you this update today or this briefing today, I will be turning around a paper very quickly, and you will have that paper for decision-making purposes on the 25th of June. For the committee on the 25th of June. So just so that we're giving you a clear idea of the timeline and sort of expectations. Trust that's okay. So over to the team.
Thank you, Sarah. Kia ora koutou katoa ko Scott Necklin, taka ingoa. As Sarah introduced, I'm from Local Government New Zealand. I'm the Deputy CE. Been working on the RAS now for about 4 or 5 years, and we'll go into a bit more detail in terms of what that journey has looked like. And yeah, Hugo, Cameron Partners, they were actually the lead advisor to the setup and establishment of the Local Government Funding Agency, so have real credibility in this space. And in fact, the mechanism behind the RAS was actually initially their idea, so I just want to acknowledge that. And then, as Sarah mentioned, Mark Butcher is on the steering group, so he's the Chief Executive of the Local Government Funding Agency. They are fully supportive of the RAS, have been from day one. Originally, Craig Stober, the Chair, was on the original steering group, so they have good support at the board level as well as at the leadership level at the funding agency. In terms of what it is, so effectively the RAS is an off-balance financing tool that is purely, primarily designed to support ratepayers and to support rate-likes charges with really effective finance. I'll hand to Hugo shortly, who's going to take us through a bit more detail in terms of the products that the RAS would support. But it is important to note, it is there to support ratepayers. There are benefits to council, particularly given its off-balance sheet, and obviously then that allows you to leverage your balance sheet, so there's some real advantages there. In terms of timing, so the Minister is supportive of the scheme. The Minister wrote to us in March this year indicating his support and also just asking us to progress now to get to that stop-go decision, which is why we're here today, and it's why we're kind of doing a roadshow across the country at the moment. The Minister has instructed his officials to start working on the RAS from August. Actually, I think it's fair to say as soon as we got that letter, we kicked the door in and have started them working on it already, and we're getting really good support from DIA. And so that is why we're here today in terms of moving forward. We do need to raise some funds to be able to complete the next stage of work. The next stage of work effectively sets up that stop-go decision, and we'll go into more detail of that at the end in terms of what the ask is and what the risk is, but just to bear in mind that any funds that have been put in to date, any funds that are used over the next couple of months to set up that stop-go decision, if it is a go, then they would be converted into equity, and obviously there's significant benefits to ratepayers, which is why we're primarily involved, and it's why we've been a champion of the RAS for the last 4 or 5 years. So I'll hand over now to Hugo, who will take us through a bit more more detail, effectively what the RAS is, what it supports and how it works.
Thanks, Scott. Kia ora koutou. We've got some slides here. I understand you've seen some similar slides in the pack that was distributed. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to go through them in any detail. These slides look very similar to the ones that are in the pack, but they're at a higher level. And the ideal sort of way we'd hope to run this session is for it to be interactive. So just following on from Scott's introduction, we've been working on the RAS for about, well, a very long time now, even longer than LGNZ. It's been something that we see real merit in for New Zealand, so it's something we're really passionate about. The context for the RAS is that New Zealand's got a number of challenges. It's got the cost of living crisis. There's a massive demographic shift going on. We're moving where there's a lot of property owners are becoming retirees, so they're effectively asset rich, but on fixed incomes and cash poor, which is unfortunately sort of coinciding with the issue that's been building for decades, which is the underinvestment in infrastructure. And so not only is there a requirement to replace and do sort of major maintenance on existing infrastructure, there's also the growth infrastructure that requires investment as well. And so when you put those issues together, it creates a massive issue for ratepayers, because ratepayers are in many cases required to actually fund the infrastructure that's required. Now, local government has a number of tools in the toolbox, and that's all that the RAS is. It's another tool. But we think it's got real merit in the sense that it doesn't use local authorities' limited financing capacity, so it's off balance sheet, and it does it in a way which is very efficient. It sort of leverages off the same structure that the LGFA has, in that it's provided to all, or it's an option for all local authorities across the country, and so it can achieve scale right across the country. And with that scale and with the structure that it has that enables it to obtain a really high credit rating, it can access very low cost finance and pass that on to ratepayers. So when we initially looked at the scheme, we were thinking about it in terms of a scheme to enable councils to provide rates postponement to ratepayers in an off-balance sheet way. But when we did the work and we came up with the structure, we realised that it had other applications, or potential applications as well. So the applications that we've been looking at are deferred development contributions, property improvement loans, and rates postponement, and we'll talk about that in coming slides. As I said, though, the RAS is very similar to the LGFA. We worked with Mark Butcher back in 2010, 2011, putting together the LGFA, and that's provided a lot of insights for us and for the steering group, not only in terms of the process that we went through, because dealing with government and local government stakeholders can be challenging at times, particularly when you require a significant proportion of local authorities to be there on day one and to fund something without any guarantee that it's necessarily going to happen. So we think we've got some insights from that process, and one of the key insights is that we've had to break it down into bite-sized chunks. So we've got well-defined stop-go decision points through the process. Many of you will be coming at it or hearing about it for the first time, but we're actually at this is stage 4 that we're about to embark on. So we've already been through 3 stages to get here. Like the LGFA, the structure is very much about ensuring that the RAS can obtain a really high credit rating, because that's the crux of it. We need to be able to provide low-cost financing, otherwise it looks just like anything else that's in the marketplace. So the structure of the RAS is set up to ensure that happens, and underpinning all of it is that the RAS, through new legislation, would have the ability to impose a levy against a property or to ratepayers in the same way that a local authority does. So the RAS is in many ways just an extension of what a local authority does, but it does it very efficiently, because it's a an organisation that has the specialist capabilities to provide financing services to ratepayers, and it does it across the country, so it gets that scale, which is critical. The difference between the RAS and the LGFA is that the RAS will lend to ratepayers, whereas the LGFA lends to local authorities. It would be a scheme that was, or an organisation, a CCO essentially, that would be owned by local authorities and central government, much like the LGFA is. But as we'll come to later on in the slides, the LGFA board has approved, subject to shareholder council approval, actually taking an equity investment or equity stake in the RAS as well. The RAS would undertake the administration of the loans, so the relationship between the ratepayer in terms of the loan that's made to the ratepayer would be managed by the RAS itself. And as I said, it's going to be off balance sheet for local authorities, so it doesn't use any finance capacity for the local authorities. The Minister for Local Government has been supportive. We've obviously had this going for some time, and Wellington's been a big supporter on the way through with Auckland, Tauranga, Hamilton and Christchurch. We did a lot of work through 2022 and 23, and we got to the point though where we'd gone as far as we could without getting a strong signal back from government, and unfortunately government's been very distracted on a range of issues. Three Waters, the Future for Local Government, and then Local Water Done Well has really taken a lot of the capacity away from government officials to focus on something new, which has been frustrating, but thankfully we've actually got the signal now from the Minister for Local Government that he is supportive, subject to us engaging with officials and confirming the business case, because we can't go forward without government support, because we do require that legislation to get this through. We've been working on this for way too long. We want to bring it to a head, and so we're pushing really hard to be in a position by the end of the year to have a stop-go decision made. So we're looking to have all the information available for the councils that want to support it, and for central government to decide whether there's sufficient merit to move to full implementation. So at the end of the year, we could be in a position where the information is such that the stakeholders decide they don't want to proceed, but if they do decide they want to proceed, then we'd be looking to get into it with the implementation targeted for sometime in 2026. So in terms of the products, there's the three products that I've talked about. The first one is deferred development contributions. You'll all be aware of what DCs are. It's an upfront payment to local authorities by developers to enable growth infrastructure to be invested in. DCs are significant. The 2026 forecast is for revenue of about 700 million to be raised nationally. And there's been the recent policy announcement by government that they're looking at a new development levy system, which, as far as we can, or what we understand, is that the development levy system is intended to widen the scope for DCs. They'll be called development levies going forward. And ultimately what that means is that there would be more revenue that would be raised. So rather than 700 million per annum, it's going to increase. Ironically, though, that the development contributions are sort of controversial. Developers push back, but then when you overlay the fact that the DLS may actually increase the impost on developers, with the supply chain issues that are in place and with inflation, ironically, the development levy system might end up impeding developments, which is what no one sort of wants to see. What the RAS can do is it can step in, and a development contribution is paid up front. The RAS could effectively finance that on behalf of the developer. And so what it could do is it could convert the upfront payment into a series of levies against the property. So firstly, the developer that owns the property, and then subsequently the future property owners could end up paying a levy rather than that DC being charged up front. It would be completely opt-in, so the developers could choose whether or not to use the scheme. And I guess the risk around this is that it potentially creates the opportunity for a windfall for developers, in the sense that rather than them paying the upfront amount for the development and getting paid back through the price of the property when they sell it, if the property doesn't adjust for the fact that there's a future levy stream against the property, then that would be a windfall for the developer. And the way we'd seek to address that is by ensuring that there's a charge against the property itself on the title of the property, and the purchaser of the property would have the option of buying the property with the development levy in place or with the development levy paid off. So the RAS would be calculating in real time what the value of that development levy is. It would be explicit, and we think that would be the way to address any concerns about the developer getting a windfall gain out of the scheme. We've engaged with developers at the direction of DIA. We had a session with. Sure. Do you want to?
We'll go through the presentation depending.
Yeah, sorry. So we've already engaged with developers, had a very positive response. One interesting data point is Auckland Council expects to receive about 200 million per annum in development contributions. 62% of that revenue comes from developers doing one property. So the mum and dad developers typically subdividing the back of their section off and putting a granny flat in place. And we think this type of product would be really attractive to them because they're not intending to sell the property on, or in many cases won't be intending to sell the property on in the short term. So rather than having to fork out the $50,000 up front for the development contribution, they can convert that into a levy that they would pay on an annual basis over, say, 30 years. The other thing to note is the financing costs associated with the RAS, because it can obtain such a high credit rating, it can raise really low-cost finance and pass the benefit of that on to ratepayers. And the expected financing costs would be between 1 to 1.5% below the standard mortgage rate. So it'll be the lowest cost finance that property owners can get for their property. So if a property owner has a mortgage and they have the option of whether buying the property with or without the levy in place, rationally they would choose to buy it with the levy in place because it'll be a low cost finance on that proportion of the value of the property essentially. The second product is property improvement loans. You'll be aware that local authorities can lend money to ratepayers to get for property improvements and then get repaid through a voluntary targeted levy. The RAS could essentially step into the shoes of the local authority and finance that. So, rather than the local authority doing it, the RAS would just do it on behalf of the local authority, so it would be off balance sheet from the local authority's point of view. There's a number of examples of local authorities that provide property improvement loans. Auckland Council inherited a home insulation scheme from Waitakere that has about 30 million in loans. When the council inherited that, they initially thought that would be a great type of scheme to roll out to the rest of Auckland. When the forecast came in and suggested that the growth might mean that scheme could grow to be like 100 million in loans, they realised that was 100 million and that they couldn't effectively use elsewhere. And so their enthusiasm for providing the scheme sort of dropped off as a result. When we've discussed with the RAS with local authorities, it's interesting how different local authorities have different focuses on what could be attractive. So we've had examples where they've talked about supporting ratepayers to put in place water tanks, which can potentially help mitigate the investment requirements at the council level. And then more recently, we've engaged with Rewiring Aotearoa, who are obviously focused on the electrification of New Zealand. They see real scope for the RAS to provide property improvement loans for investment in solar panels and electric vehicles, that type of thing. It's just jumping on to the next product. So the next one, this is what we originally thought was the sole product, but which is is just one of the three now. Rates postponement, you're probably aware of rates postponement as an option. Most councils actually provide it as a potential service although the uptake's very low. Essentially, what happens in that situation is if a ratepayer chooses to defer their rates, and if they're approved, then the RAS could step in, make payment on behalf of that ratepayer to the local authority, so the local authority's kept whole, and then effectively have a loan balance sitting against the property, which ultimately gets repaid on sale of the property. So that helps address a lot of the demographic shift that's going underway. There are a lot of property owners, including my parents, that have got a freehold property, but they really are sort of cash constrained, and they're facing increasing rates, and would be very keen on this type of scheme, particularly if the financing rate is, what we're talking about, 1 to 1.5% below the standard mortgage rate. Important to note that in principle, it's not just rates that could be deferred this way. It could be any local authority charge if it's structured appropriately. So haven't spent a lot of time sort of putting our minds to that, but there's scope in future for other local authority charges to be treated in the same way. One of the alternatives to rates postponement is reverse mortgages or equity release products, which are great, except for the cost. The establishment fees are very high, and the implicit interest rates are very high as well. So 8 to 9% for reverse mortgages, double digit for equity release products. So it's likely that the RAS could provide the same product for at 4 to 5% or more below what those competing products in the private sector could or would provide. Important to note though that the RAS would be deferring local government charges. It's not providing funds for property owners to take overseas trips or to put a spa pool on. It's only for specific or whatever's approved, I guess, ultimately by government and local government in terms of what qualifies as a property improvement loan. As a qualifying charge. In terms of precedents, we have come up with or identified a great precedent in British Columbia and Canada. There's a Kiwi that runs the scheme in BC. It's been running for a long time now. BC has a very similar, what they call a property tax. Over there, the average property tax per property is about 4,000 per property, whereas New Zealand it's more like 3 for rates. Their scheme's been going for some time. There's about 83,000 users. Almost 4% of households in BC use the scheme. And when we first looked at the scheme in 2016, it was around 670 million in loans. That's grown to 2.7 billion in the last 8 years, which is a massive increase. We've spoken with Stephanie, who heads up the division, who asked her the reason for the growth, and she said it's twofold. Firstly, they're facing the same demographic shift that we are in New Zealand. There's just a growing cohort of asset-rich and cash-poor property owners. And then secondly, because the scheme had been running for so long, it was a very manual, paper-based application process, which essentially was turning people off. And they've moved to an IT-based system where the application process is very streamlined now. It takes 20 to 30 minutes to apply. And because of the removal of that friction or the transaction sort of costs, has just meant that the uptake's been massive. They've said that they're envious of what we've got in New Zealand because we're starting from scratch. We've got a blank sheet of paper, so we can actually design the scheme the way they'd prefer it was set up in BC as well.
I wonder if we should take some questions there on those products, because we have a few. Councillor McNulty?
I've got 3 if we have time, but I can... on the deferred development contributions, have you had conversations with banks so that knowledge is built into their mortgage approval process? Because initially this could really capture lenders off guard if they're not aware of this product in this scheme.
Short answer, no. We haven't spoken to the banks yet. Look, it's ultimately something that will rank ahead of the banks. So I'm sure, that's something that they'll consider. We're not expecting it to be such a significant sum that it's going to be of huge concern to the banks. The modelling we've done suggests that across all the products, that the RAS balance sheet could grow to sort of 4 to 5 billion in loans over, say, a 10-year period, which is just dwarfed by the lending to property in New Zealand.
Yep. In terms of the improvement loans, so I'm assuming things like climate change resilience, putting on my Iona hat for a minute, would be in scope, but how are you going to evaluate whether those property improvement loans, fit into a criteria? You're going to be quite strict? Is it going to be a human being? How's it? Yeah.
Look, ultimately, the RAS has no discretion. It's really an extension of what local authorities want it to do. So there would be an approval process that would need to be undertaken to get approval for the RAS to actually provide any property improvement loans in the first place.
Yeah.
And then while it's a national scheme, it's subject. Every local authority can decide which products that it provides or not. But fundamentally, there needs to be criteria. For example, you'd need to be able to provide to qualify for rates deferral. You'd need a certain amount of equity in the home and an insurance certificate, for example, that type of thing.
And just to add to that, so the way we see, particularly, I guess, the property improvement loans working is there would be maybe some nationally agreed standards in a particular category, and so therefore that then gives council the option to opt into that particular, to that particular kind of, side product. But then if you have a specific need in your area that might be different to other areas, then there's a process where you can go through an application process and set that up specifically. So I would kind of go the electrification piece. That to me would be a national category. And then it's an automatic kind of opt-in process.
Cool. Last one was just, you talked about how local authority charges could be postponed. So you're thinking things like resource consent fees in addition to the rates? Or when you said local authority charges, what category?
Probably the IFF levy or something if you were thinking about our case rather than actual charges that we do on an operational level. They're things that get attached to the household.
Okay.
Or the ratepayers.
Thank you.
I had a question. Obviously, for us, there would be an interest in seismic strengthening, and how much thought has gone into that as a feature of this?
The RAS works really well for discrete projects and projects that can be sort of replicated. So seismic strengthening, for example, if it was chimney removal, that would be, I would have thought, would fit squarely in that. Bespoke seismic strengthening is more difficult. For example, if it was a apartment building that required seismic strengthening, that would be a special case, and we can see challenges in coming up with a solution there.
I think for our council, seismic strengthening of apartment buildings would be something we would really be interested in as a kind of a feature of this, because those are ongoing, kind of almost insurmountable challenges for those building owners. So,
and the other issue there, I guess, is there's multiple owners of apartment buildings, so there's all those challenges. Not saying it's not can't be done. I'm just saying it's challenging, and possibly wouldn't be the first cab off the rank in terms of the property improvement loans that were being provided.
Okay.
Can I just add to that? So the property improvement loans are a little bit more complex because effectively you're funding a third party to complete some work. So the way we would see this operating is the rates postponement and the deferred development contributions. They're actually really easy to stand up, and the development contributions are probably what kind of gives this the viability. And we've just engaged with ECA, and they're very supportive, particularly with the property improvement loans. So they've done a lot of work in terms of how you would go about kind of bringing in those third parties and that payment system, and then identifying just how you identify preferred suppliers. So I think we that would be that is the harder one to crack, but it's certainly doable, and certainly what we would want to do over the next phase of work is kind of look at how do we identify those products that people are particularly interested in. Electrification is a big one, and then potentially look at that earthquake strengthening aspect as well.
I think that would be really helpful for us. I think would be an item of real interest in terms of our ongoing involvement. Deputy Mayor Foon.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just particularly interested in the home improvements, particularly around electrification. I just want to check all the ducks are in a row for that, like the minister's supportive. Has there been any feedback from other councils? And second question, what has the feedback from other councils been like in general?
So actually we've had really good support to date with the 5 metro councils that Hugo mentioned before. In this current round, we had Tauranga confirm their commitment yesterday, and Auckland confirmed their commitment about 18 months, 2 years ago. We have recently met with Queenstown Lakes District Council. They're particularly interested in that electrification piece, and in fact RAS was actually mentioned in their regional deal proposal, and so we've had a really good conversation with them. They'll be putting up a paper to look to provide support to this in the next few weeks. We met with Hutt City last week and got a really good reception. They're looking to put a paper up. We've had some dialogue with Hamilton, likewise, really good reception. We were meeting with them just last week. They'll be putting a paper up as well. New Plymouth District Council are doing likewise, and I'm sure I've missed a couple. Christchurch, we're in engagement with Christchurch at the moment, but we're still waiting on their kind of I guess their support in terms of going to the next step. So we're getting really good support. There is an ask at the end of this, which I'll cut to, which is we need to raise 2.5 million, which does have quite a healthy contingency there of 20%. And at the moment, based on the support that we've given at the moment, you are potentially going to be a little bit oversubscribed. So it's great, but we've still got a few council decisions to get through. Just to note, if you do decide to support this, it would be dependent on making sure that we've raised the 2.5 million. So we're not looking to spend any of that until we know we've actually got that money secured, and then we'll pull it down. Yep.
Councillor Chung?
Great, thanks very much. I have 2 questions. What are the administrative costs of this compared to banks? Particularly charging with reverse mortgages, because a lot of banks have been promoting this very heavily.
So at this stage, the estimate of the operating costs is about 7 million per annum. That's obviously in the next stage of work, we'll be looking to firm up those assumptions as well.
Mm-hmm. How would that work out per loan though? Like, would you have a fixed percentage of the loan as a cost, or would it be a fixed amount, or how would that actually work?
So those are fixed costs, essentially, and I mean the key sort of the economics of the RAS is that we've assumed that it will make a net interest margin of 1%. Mm-hmm. So it should raise its finance at sort of similar level to what the LGFA can, and then the difference between the LGFA's cost of funds and the standard mortgage rate is about 2.5%. Mm-hmm. So we've assumed the first 1% of that is used to cover the operating costs, and then the rest of the differential is the benefit to the ratepayer. So based on the RAS having 7 million of operating costs, we need to get it to 700 million of loans to cover that 7 million of operating costs. Below that, we're making a loss, and it's unsustainable. Above that, we're making a surplus, and that's a return for shareholders. Mm-hmm. So the critical decision for stakeholders is how quickly can the RAS get to 700 million in loans. Mm-hmm. And so there's various data points. We've got the nationally development contributions are 700 million per annum. So how many of those development contributions can we capture? Mm-hmm. With the deferred or rates postponement, we've got the precedent in British Columbia where the current loan book there is 2.7 billion. So how quickly will we follow British Columbia? So those are the first 2 key data points, I think, that we need to consider. And then we haven't, in our base case modelling that we've done, we haven't assumed any property improvement loans. So to the extent that property improvement loans come on board, that would just bolster the economics for the RAS.
Okay, and second question, what sort of seed money would you be looking at from Wellington? Would it be based on the per head of population, or would it be based on the amount of loans you can that actually come up?
I think that's at your discretion, and so to support the next phase of work, Auckland and Tauranga have both committed 500,000, and then the kind of smaller metros and larger provincials are in the kind of 200 to 300 quantum, and so I think that's your decision. I think the thing to note that nobody can hold more than 20%, otherwise it will be on balance sheet. So there's two stages here. One is to raise funds to do the next stage of work. That sets up the stop-go decision. That money, just to be clear, is obviously at risk. If it is a go decision, then we need to raise effectively $30 million. That's to effectively stand up the RAS and then to support it in its first 4 years of operation until it effectively breaks even. Nobody can put in more than 20% of equity, otherwise it'd be on your balance sheet. And then I guess at that time it's your decision as to how much you want to take out in terms of how much shareholding you want to have, and that's using the exact same model as the local government funding agency. So we've kind of, cookie-cutted that approach. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Councillor Rogers.
Yeah, I sort of had two questions. The one was around the impacts on the LGFA and people's willingness to lend finances to the LGFA. Has any modelling been done on sort of how preferable people would find the rate that the LGFA is able to secure and therefore the rate that they pass on to councils?
Well, it's actually, the slide's probably useful for that. So what the slide sets out is who would potentially own shares in the RAS, and then how is the financing provided. So the expectation is that local authorities, central government and LGFA will all have shares in RAS, but also that the LGFA will have more of an operational role. So it actually provides capital right across the capital structure. So it provides equity. Because the balance sheet will grow over time, we need to ensure that the equity ratio grows as well, and the RAS would be looking to invest in what we've called preference shares, but as essentially equity as well. So they'll be providing that capital, and then the LGFA also provides a limited amount of debt finance to enable the RAS to make loans and then build up a tranche of loans which it can then go and basically sort of issue bonds into the marketplace with. So the LGFA is absolutely critical to the RAS in terms of the arrangements or the way the RAS finances itself and the way it operates, because LGFA, in addition to that finance, also has an operational role providing shared services for head office type functions, but also doing the debt issuance as well on behalf of RAS. And it's unfortunate that Mark's not here, because clearly there's a lot of similarity between RAS bonds and LGFA bonds, but there will be a difference. Obviously, one's fundamentally a local government sort of credit risk, whereas the other is a whole group of ratepayers. The risk ultimately is that the ratepayers don't repay the loans. And looking at British Columbia, there's 83,000 users. You could easily see RAS lending to 100,000 users over time. So it's quite a diverse, group of ratepayers there. But trying to cut to to your question, I don't think Mark is seeing that there's any risk to LGFA. They're different securities, they're different organisations, and they'll be issuing bonds to investors in their own name, in their own right.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Hugo, but there's also a guarantee structure in place.
You're correct. So there's multiple sort of levels of security for RAS. There's the capital structure to start with. There'll be, and this is all based on the LGFA as a precedent. There's a large liquidity or sort of tranche of liquid assets. So this is all about what happens in a situation where there's a cash crunch, for example. So there's all those sort of there's the equity, there's the preference shares, there's the liquid assets that can be used. We'll be seeking a liquidity support facility from government, which is what the LGFA also has. And this is all on the basis that, firstly, there's been enough individual ratepayers that haven't paid back their loans that have caused some sort of credit crunch. But there's also, as there is with the LGFA, the expectation that there'd be a modified joint and several guarantee provided by local authorities as well. So any local authority that is providing this RAS's services to its ratepayers would sign up to a modified joint and several guarantee where across the whole of the country, depending on how many loans there are, whatever proportion that council's loans ratepayers borrow would be the proportion that they would need to support under a guarantee.
Yeah, because I guess my follow-up question to that is I'm trying to analyse this kind of from two lenses, one of which is how preferable the scheme is to the balance sheet of the council, and one is kind of the whole of economy benefit, because I guess I would have a concern of sort of, is it actually just better for councils to carry that as bad debt, from a whole of economy perspective, than offering a separate service? It sounds like it's probably better to do it this way. But I guess, my concern would be, is it creating something that is at a whole of economy scale less efficient for moving capital?
It's much like the LGFA. The LGFA is the most efficient way for local authorities to raise finance, and this is the same structure, essentially. So it will be more efficient because of the credit quality. It'll be high as the highest local authority, if not higher than most, in terms of what it can raise. It'll provide the services across the country. So rather than individual local authorities replicating the capability and capacity to provide loans, it will do it in one place. So it'll be a specialist organisation to do it. So the expectation is this will be by far the most efficient way to do it. And I guess the added benefit is it's not using up local authorities' balance sheet capacity.
And probably just to add to that, this is actually for charges that ratepayers actually need to pay in some way, shape or form. And so it's providing, I guess, a choice that they don't currently have. And it is obviously, much more effective and efficient than other financing options. And I guess part of that consideration is obviously potentially selling a property to pay for charges. So this would offer a much more attractive opportunity compared to a reverse mortgage or even a standard mortgage. And the other thing to note too, this doesn't replace the rates rebate scheme, which obviously we're delighted that the government have just announced an increased envelope in terms of the budget for that. So that rates rebate scheme is still there if people meet the criteria. This is, I guess, an added tool.
Can I ask one more? The other question that I had around this process was kind of, in doing this work, has much effort gone into kind of understanding, for those other products that you mentioned, is the refusal to uptake it primarily driven by the cost of doing so, or are there other factors involved? Like, I guess I've heard from many people that actually they don't want to do that because actually it's the refusal to pay rather than the fact that they couldn't finance the ability to take up that option.
Are you thinking? Are you referring to rates postponement?
Yeah, or reverse mortgage, or just leveraging your house more.
Yeah, I think there is a cultural issue. Most Kiwis spend their whole lives paying off their houses, and so just once they retire to actually start borrowing against the house again, it's going to be anathema to a big bunch of property owners. That being said, I think you can't get away from the fact, and rates or local government charges are going to increase. They have to increase to ensure that New Zealand can do the investment that it needs to do to be a first world country. And at the same time, that big group of property owners aren't earning more money. They've got a nest egg, they're getting super, and they've got a nest egg. They're not in the workforce anymore, so they've got fixed income. So that's staying at one level, whereas the charges that are coming at them are increasing. So I think that's just going to drive those property owners to this type of product, whether it's through a reverse mortgage from the private sector or to a scheme like this, which is provided by local authorities and government.
And we are seeing the reverse mortgage sector grow as well. So there's obviously demand there to finance. Now they're potentially financing other things than rate likes charges, but if you're able to then do rates postponement, that might be $3,000 that you can then use elsewhere, or don't necessarily have to find from your fixed income.
Councillor Brown.
What is the security over the property owner?
It's effectively the ability to impose a levy, which ranks pari passu with rates. So the RAS would have the same ability as the local authority to impose a charge, and if there's non-payment, and ultimately the ultimate outcome is that the property's sold, it will rank ahead of even a first mortgage. It'll have priority in any sale.
So in terms of the stress situation, so if there's unpaid rates, where first? Water charges, where do they? And then you've got you guys. Is that how it would stack up? and then you have the banks.
The intention is that it would rank pari passu with rates. So the RAS is essentially providing a service that local authorities otherwise would provide. So the charge would rank equally, and there would be a cross-default situation.
Right.
So obviously there's detail we need to work through, but the current straw man is that if there was non-payment of rates, or if there's non-payment of a RAS levy, that would be a cross-default, and it would be up to the local authority and RAS to work together to ultimately get repaid.
But when you say that it's off balance sheet, I can see there isn't an explicit loan, but we effectively have a contingent liability equal to the amount of borrowing which is provided to our ratepayers.
There'll be a joint and several guarantee to that extent, but the same thing applies with LGFA. There's a joint and several guarantee provided by local authorities to LGFA. It's not in the accounts in any way. It's not even there as a contingent liability on the noted to the accounts.
But that's we've got the liability there, so it's okay. But I mean, in the case of this, because after we have borrowed the dough from LGFA, but in this case, there will be there'll be an arm's length arrangement, I can see, but we've got a liability in respect of the $10 million or whatever our ratepayers have actually borrowed. So it's hard to imagine that our auditors or S&P aren't going to say, you better actually be pretty explicit about that.
Well, with the borrowings from the LGFA, that is on your balance sheet, because you're borrowing it.
Yeah.
It's in relation to the joint and several guarantee that would, the contingent liability would potentially come through.
No, I get that, but I'm saying that that's different because we've got a specific liability, i.e. what we borrow, and if we have a joint and several liability thing going on as well, I understand why you'd offset one against the other, and you just take the load as sufficient. But in this particular case, if I was looking at the credit circumstance of the council, I would be saying, you've got a guarantee here, and that's, there's no specific liability, but there is a guarantee for $10 million. We think that we should factor that into your, debt equity ratios or however you want to actually calculate it.
Yeah, I look at, and that's the advice we need to get from PwC, which we've had advice to date, and they've looked at the precedent of the LGFA, and it's not in the accounts.
What about S&P?
We've had preliminary discussions with S&P. We haven't actually. S&P's reluctant to give advice until you pay them, so that's what we see as being part of the next stage through to being able to make a fully informed decision at the end of the year. So we're looking to get a rating evaluation done by S&P of the structure.
If it did $700 million, spread across all councils, but if 700 is a sort of starting point, it could be quite a chunky liability. And I guess that I'm sort of looking at it from the perspective of thinking, council has now become extremely precious about its debt headroom.
Yeah.
And this is clearly creating an avenue where our debt headroom could be eroded by the success of this facility. But which I guess gets to another point is, let's say we wanted to be able to manage our exposures. In other words, we decided we didn't want to go past 50 million. Can we actually manage the settings for Wellington residents so that we would get to the 50 and then go for no further?
And it's detail we need to work through. There's no reason I can see why individual councils couldn't limit their exposure. Ultimately, it's an opt-in structure, both for local authorities and for individual ratepayers. So, there's no reason why local authorities could decide there's no more rates postponement, for example, available in the area.
Well, I was thinking we might start with just rates postponement and then bolt on other things depending on the success of stage one. Because our biggest, I'm not too sure about the role of council replacing the banks funding solar panels or something, but I can see that rates postponement is, we've created the problem, so we're offering the solution. It's a completely different sort of moral case, if you like.
Yeah. So in answer to your question, there's absolutely it's at the discretion of individual councils as to what services it's providing through the RAS.
And sorry, one last question. I remember Sarah and I've had this conversation from a couple of years ago when I first turned up on council. It does seem to have taken an unbelievably long time to have got to just another presentation. What's the most optimistic timeline before we could actually be offering our ratepayers this service?
So I think once we've kind of got that stop-go decision, we believe we could have this up and running in 12 to 18 months. I mean, there's some complexities in there. It's a CCO, so it will require some consultation. But once we're at that point where we've got, effectively the government enacting and writing legislation, we've got the funding support, it's 12 to 18 months to stand up. Just to talk to the timeline, so this is, effectively we're now entering stage 4. Stage 1 was initially a concept testing that was done in sort of 2022. That then needed to go back to the 5 metros and the funding agency and ourselves to kind of go, okay, do we now want to support the development of a business case? So obviously that just takes a bit of time. We then completed the business case at about the same time as the Future of Local Government review was being kicked off. And so the government at that time indicated their support for it, but put it into the review. It was actually highlighted in the report as a recommendation, but at that point in time, the elections were about 6 months away, and so the government of the day indicated that they were supportive. And then in terms of engagement with this government, obviously they've had a set of priorities for the first 12 months of their term. The minister was supportive from day one, but we just needed to wait till the timing, aligned, and that's kind of where we're at now. So, we've had intentional stop-go decisions to this point. So while it has taken sort of 5 years, I think that's actually a prudent approach, and it's also just aligning the political cycles and the political priorities.
So I've got 2 more lots of questions, and then one, and then we'll finish the presentation. So make sure we don't run out of time. Deputy Mayor Foon.
Yeah, just thinking a lot of our rates will be shifting over to the new water entities. So, and I may have missed it, but will they be is it planned that they be part of the scheme, or is this just for local authorities?
I think given what sort of charges will be charged at this stage, it won't be anticipated that this could be covering that. But Hugo did talk about future changes that could come around. It could be considered in the future. I would think more akin to our IFF levies that we've currently got on there would likely come in ahead of perhaps water charges.
Continue on. Okay. Right. So the next slide, I mean, probably won't spend too much time on this, but this is really just how the cash flows work. So just talking through those. In the case of rates postponement and deferred development contributions, essentially what happens is the local authority makes a charge to the ratepayer that the ratepayer is required to pay, either as a ratepayer paying a rate or a developer paying a development contribution. In that situation, the ratepayer would have an option. They could apply through the local authority's website to either defer the development contribution or postpone their rates. The application, and this is the way we'd sort of see it happening in practice, but it's still to be confirmed, would see that application going directly to the RAS, assuming the RAS approved either the deferred DC or the rates postponement. The RAS would then make payment on behalf of the ratepayer to the local authority, so the local authority is kept whole at all times. And then there's a relationship between the RAS and the ratepayer, and the RAS will effectively levy the ratepayer at the right time to ensure it gets repaid. So in the case of a deferred DC, that would be an annual levy over a prescribed period. In the case of rates postponement, the RAS would, at the time of sale, would levy the ratepayer to ensure that it gets repaid the full amount that it's owed. In the case of property improvement loans, it's slightly different. The application process would look much the same, but then the RAS would make payment to an approved supplier of the product to the ratepayer rather than it being paid through to the local authority. So that relationship would be between the RAS and the supplier and the RAS and the ratepayer. Obviously, it's critical that the RAS is self-sustaining, so that's been a big part of our focus. It's working up the business case for the RAS, and the business case suggests that there's potentially strong commercial returns available to the shareholders in the RAS. The financial modelling that we've done, we've actually done multiple scenarios, but what we're showing here is the base case scenario. and that base case has assumed that we get 25% of development contributions nationally. So the forecast, the local government forecasts indicate there's 700 million likely to be received in 2026. We've assumed we get 25% of that, but certainly the feedback from developers is that they would love this type of product, and so I guess we've been conservative in that sense. Rates postponement, we've assumed that the rates postponement will ramp up over time, and that within 10 years' time, 3% of households in New Zealand would be using rates postponement, and that compares to 4% in British Columbia at the moment. We haven't assumed any property improvement loans. We've assumed that the net interest margin is 1%, and that ultimately, once the RAS achieves break even, that all surplus cash flow is available to distribute to shareholders. So what that implies is that we'd need about 30 million in equity up front to stand the RAS up. 15 of that is the establishment costs, so advisors and the IT system, which has to be obviously robust and be able to, it needs to be a system that can minimise the amount of personnel involvement, so that's a key focus. And then the remaining 15 million is to provide sufficient cash while the RAS achieves that break-even position. So we've worked on the basis that we need to be conservative. It's one thing to ask local authorities for money to set a scheme up, but it's another thing to go back in 3-4 years' time and say, look, we've run out of money, we need some more. So we're working on the basis that we need to really confident that we'll have too much capital and rather than too little capital. The modelling shows that the uptake of loans would mean that the RAS would break even in year 4. Full payback of the investment would happen in year 8, and by year 15 it would be returning over 100% on an annual basis to the shareholders. And depending on how the growth goes, it could, obviously it could continue to go up from there as well.
I won't dwell on the side for too long because I think we've covered it, but effectively we're looking to set up that stop-go decision sort of, November, December this year, and that's kind of why we're at a critical juncture now. Also just want to note, obviously this is kind of out of cycle with kind of normal local government, and so I just want to recognise that and understand that that's not always an easy process. I guess we have the opportunity now to push forward, and so we are kind of pushing hard, and so I just wanted to acknowledge that it is a little bit out of sync of the normal local government cycle. We've kind of touched on this, but just to sort of recap, so we are looking for funding support at the moment to set up that stop-go decision. We need to raise 2.5 million across the supporters. That does include a good healthy contingency of 20%, because as Hugo said, last thing we want to do is have to come back and ask for more funding, and then that will basically drive a stop-go decision in Q4. Just want to note that obviously if it's a stop decision, that money and that funding is at risk. If it's a go decision and then we stand up the RAS, then all of that is any funds that are put in to date, any funds that help support the next development will then obviously convert into equity and shareholding. As Hugo said before, ultimately, if it is a go decision, we need to raise 30 million, and that is to obviously stand the RAS up and then to operate it for 4 years or 3 years, so it breaks even in the 4th year. And I guess just to note, without the kind of funding at the moment, then obviously at this stage, we would have to put the RAS on ice, which would be a real shame because we think there are huge benefits to ratepayers, but also benefits to council as well. So yes, thank you very much for your time today. Happy to take any kind of further questions.
I do think a RAS on ice sounds like maybe a sort of a cocktail I would have drunk in the early 90s. Councillor Brown.
So this actually relates to a side of a couple of them ago, but so let's assume I'm a resident and I've drawn down 10 grand or something rather to pay for a solar panel or whatever it is. How much discretion do I have to actually determine my repayment schedule?
The expectation is there'd be a set repayment schedule. So, I mean, once again, it's still subject to the criteria being set, but the schemes that we've would have seen in the past in New Zealand, it's typically around a 10-year sort of payback period for the property improvement loans. No problem. Repaying early is fine. And the expectation is that there'd also be a crystallisation on sale of a property where the property improvement loan would need to be repaid as well, so that a new owner is not inheriting that levy.
Can you use your mic, Tim?
With respect to the $30 million, or the 30, is it 30 or 32.5?
No, it includes the 2.5.
So, I mean, let's assume council said, let's go, we're supportive. I mean, how much discretion do we have in terms of the percentage?
Once again, it's up to the individual councils to decide how much they want to invest. Ultimately, we need to get to 30. Beggars can't be choosers. I mean, that being said...
but if we want a 51%?
Sorry, the maximum...
okay, we can't have one.
Maximum is 20%, yeah. And so there's 2 points, there's 2 stages going forward. One is the 2.5 million, that obviously is at risk. If it's a go decision, then we will come back to those supporters and give kind of first right of refusal, and then ask councils how much they particularly want to support that. But the maximum that anybody can take is 20%.
And is the government coming up with any of the 30?
We are looking for the government to take a share, so there does need to be proximity to government, just like there is with the funding agency.
What about private investors?
Tim, you're supposed to be asking your questions through
Oh,
me.
sorry. What about private? Rebecca's got some money and she'd like to invest.
We'll take it.
We know that's not true, Tim.
We just in terms of that, so we do think this is a local government service, and therefore it's a service to ratepayers. We're mindful that if you have different, different objectives at that board table, then you potentially end up with a different objective and a different outcome. And so I guess our preference at this stage is to see this as a public service that potentially provides benefits to ratepayers, but also potentially a return to council, and then not have that potential conflict of objective at that board table, further down the track. So I think we just got to be mindful of that.
And Sarah, I'm assuming the paper that you bring to us will have a recommendation or recommendations with options around funding level from us.
Correct. I will gauge the appetite from the various stakeholders, and I will come back probably with a couple of options. But through you, Chair, I'm happy to take some direction on that.
Thank you. Councillor Wineta.
Okay, I have far too many bullet points, so I'll choose 3. Okay, I'll start with this one. This is sort of returning to first principles, and I might ask it somewhat tactlessly, so you'll have to forgive me. But I understand that there is a lot of architecture that has been done to create desirable products for some ratepayers and an effective revenue stream for local authorities. But I guess what I'm really thinking about is from the I can't believe I was about to say consumer. From the citizen's perspective, who might be wanting to access this, the person who probably needs this is already dealing with a whole fleet of tiny loans and rebates and allowances and grants and microfinances from WINS and ACC, from Council Te Toi Mahana, from the bank, and now RAS. So I suppose the question is, how do we make this yet another tiny, papering over of a crack into something that will actually reach the people who need it the most? How are you going to actually penetrate into the market? Oh my God, I can't believe I just said market. Into the need, indeed, the need for the sort of the stratum of person who might require access to a scheme like this. How are you going to actually communicate that this exists to that person and get by?
That's a tricky question. I mean, the RAS is not about providing more debt to people that are already, completely indebted. It's there'll be criteria set that people need to comply with in order to qualify for loans. It'll be up to government and local government to decide what that criteria is. So for rates postponement, it may be that there's an equity requirement. Property improvement loans, I mean, I could see merit in that being available to property owners who have a genuine need for, say, home insulation, for example, or for double glazing. But that's ultimately up to the shareholders and local government and central government as the approvers of what RAS can do to decide who qualifies and what the criteria are.
And I guess this is primarily a financing vehicle. It's not necessarily, I guess, diving into kind of, policy. As I said before, it doesn't replace the rates rebate scheme, so that option is still available to people. I think what will be required when this is stood up is, some very strong comms and marketing. And I think we mentioned before, but if we didn't, we should have. ECA are very supportive of this, so they're looking to support the development process of this, but in particular, they're looking to do the kind of outreach marketing as well. So yeah, I'm not sure if we've fully answered your question, but.
And sorry, just on further to that, so with rewiring Aotearoa approach, they see cash flow benefits and investment being made into solar panels, for example. And so for many potential users of that type of product, they don't necessarily have the cash up front. They haven't got the 20 grand to buy the solar panels to save the money. So there's that potential angle as well.
Sure, okay, thank you. That did answer the question. I guess my second one is that it really seems as if the business model outlined in the business case slide kind of relies on a certain stable proportion of ratepayers being mildly impoverished and moderately indebted. Is this does this seem like a desirable state of affairs? Even if this does create new revenue streams for council, is it desirable to have a whole bunch of people constantly putting off charges they would otherwise have rebated or paid up front?
If the alternative is they can't pay them and they've got to sell their houses, I do see it as being preferable. It gives optionality to ratepayers. They're not being forced to use it. It's an option for them to use it. And, the alternative in many cases would be to go to the private sector and take out a really expensive reverse mortgage.
Okay. And the final question is, I suppose, actually, no, that's all. Thank you very much.
Deputy Mayor Foon. Councillor Rogers.
I apologise, this was originally a joke question, but then it did make me think a little bit more. You mentioned sort of like not paying for other things like holidays and spas, and then I guess my immediate thought was that money is fungible, so essentially it could indirectly be used for paying those things. And so I guess my question is, what mechanisms do we use to assess whether this is something that is actually need and would assist someone who otherwise would not have the means to make the payment and who isn't going to use, I guess, the relief to then finance other things.
Yeah, we're not loaning to Tim Brown, for example.
Exactly.
Yes, is this sort of 10% on top of the
So I guess, that was the actual question.
I don't think the scheme would discriminate against Tim Brown if you want to use it.
All right, are there...
Oh no, but the actual question was still
so
there.
there's not a kind of a need, you're asking, is there kind of a,
Yeah, needs-based assessment or parameters. Or...
Yeah, I think the assessment criteria is going to be quite strict, but it's still to be worked through. Right. I mean, we've got Michael in the back of the room who's probably could talk to how many struggling ratepayers he has, contacting him through his team, whether that demonstrates a need or not. There's always going to exist a moral hazard.
Isn't the question what is the protections in the RAS to ensure that the money is spent on what it was intended to be spent on?
I mean, the money will go, for the property improvement loans, the money will obviously go directly to the approved suppliers, as the team has said. In the case of rates deferral, the money comes directly to council, so it doesn't pass through the pockets of the ratepayers, as far as I understand.
No, that's correct.
But what they do with an alternative source of funds that they may have, and they're just using this similar to the student loan schemes, etc., that we've seen in the past, and those schemes were used as they were. So I don't know if that answers the question, but we can put as much rigour in place. Often people can find a way around it.
Councillor Wineta?
Yeah, look, if we're doing semi-joke questions...
I don't think we are.
Well, there's a kernel of something in there, I hope, which is that, the deferred DCs actually do sound good, and we are battling around this table constantly about the various points of view on DCs, but how do we prevent it, like several other doomed attempts to reform the DC system, how do we prevent this particular product from funding tax loopholes for developers?
I'm not sure I've got the answer. I don't know what the tax loopholes are that you're talking about.
Okay, I think that's brought us to the end. We're sort of in that silly stage of the afternoon. Thank you, Hugo and Scott. That was very interesting, and we look forward to the paper. Thanks, team.
Thank you very much.